interdisciplinary studies. And the occasion is made all the more special for we organize this in collaboration with ISHET, that is Indian Society for the History of Economic Thought. And incidentally, this also happens to be the first major event for their organization. I am Mrinalini Jha. I teach economics at the university, and I take the role of Assistant Director, Training and Capacity Building in the office. Today, we have for you a stellar lineup of speakers across 2 panels. The first one will have 2 papers on the new approaches in HET. And the second panel with 3 papers, which will be focusing specifically on the Indian economic thought. But before that, of course, we will have the keynote address by Dr. Alex Thomas, who will be proposing HET as an antidote to economists' amnesia. Before we commence the symposium, however, please allow me a minute to talk about our freshly instituted office, headed by Professor Deepanshu Mohan at the O.P. Jindal Global University. So IDEA's Office of Interdisciplinary Studies serves as a university-wide incubator for interdisciplinary research by providing an inter-domain institutional space for cross-pedagogical learning and research. Now, through a sustained long-term engagement with scholars who are interested in working beyond the strict contours of their own disciplines, IDEAS facilitates collaborations across JGU scholars, external collaborators, practitioners, policymakers, think tanks, and of course, civil society stakeholders in order to create a novel research and training ecosystem. Now, at the office, we facilitate this through 6 multidisciplinary constellations. And by constellations, we simply mean groups of scholars across disciplines with a common overarching research interest. I would urge you all to please visit our website to know more about the work we are doing. We will put the link in the chat box for your ease. Additionally, we welcome collaborations from all of you. So please write to us if you would want to explore more on how we could engage with you or your institution for that matter. Now, coming back to the symposium. Today, the symposium has been organized under the constellation called Understanding Indian Economy, which I am leading, along with Dr. Avnendranath Thakur. And he's there in the call already. So I will request Avnendra to please come in and introduce the work and vision of the constellation. Thank you all for joining again.
Thank you, Mrinalini, for giving a brief idea about ideas. And good morning to everyone. I'm Avnendra Thakur. By training, I'm a development economist, and I teach different courses like inequality and also history of economic thought to undergrads. So basically, the constellation, which Mrinalini already highlighted some points. So it's basically understanding the Indian economy. And this constellation, of course, group of economists who are working under this constellation, aims to investigate various micro and macro issues of contemporary relevance to Indian economic growth and development. It will bring together some meaningful research focusing on aspects of Indian economy, such as, of course, not limited to evolution of the Indian economy from a historical perspective, measurement of poverty and inequality, of households and individual outcomes, labor market dynamics, issues relating to Indian agriculture, among others. In fact, to achieve this, the constellation attracts economic historians, development economists, applied microeconomists, macroeconomists, and other academicians interested in deepening their understanding of the Indian economy through different lenses. If we talk about the structure of the constellation, there are core members and they are member associates, which are from the university and outside the universities. And some young scholars who are pursuing their PhDs are also part of the research as part of as a capacity of junior research fellows. And there are some outstanding economists who are also working as in advisory role. So some of the research projects which are already took some shape in our constellations are, of course, again, not limited to, but only giving us some basic research questions which are already there in the constellations are, for instance, is there an Indian school of economic thought? visible and invisible hands, how the state created market in early neoliberal India, the biopolitics of data in India, does data create society or merely measure it? How do caste and gender affect labor force participation in contemporary India? Some aspect of debt in contemporary India, labor market inequalities, undercurrents beneath the overall trends. How do inheritances shape wealth inequality, evidence from India, understanding household consumption expenditure surveys, estimated economic cost of terrorism in Jammu and Kashmir. These are the topics which are already highlighted, which have already took some shape, and some kind of research are already began on that. And in fact, the Constellation is definitely keen to attract more researchers in the capacity of either member associates or junior research fellows or advisors, and is open to exploring new research areas as well. So I hope that many things would clear over the course of the symposium. And if you have any interest, if you want to know anything more about it, please do visit our site, which has more elaborated idea about the research, ongoing research project on that. Thank you. I think let's move forward to start the symposium.
Sharmeen, please come. Yeah, thanks.
Yes. Hi. Hello. Good morning, everyone. And yeah, we are glad to see a number of participants over here. And my name is Shaman, and I am a research fellow with ideas, but I am also a member of ISHET. So this is, of course, today a very exciting collaborative event that is being held. So before we move on to the keynote address in a little while, I'll just try to give a brief introduction to ISHET, basically, so that we have some idea about it, and the kind of and to understand that also we need to get a sense of the importance of the history of economic thought as a discipline, as an area of study, because as we know, it is a much more marginalized area within mainstream economics, especially as it's taught the world over. There are few centers relatively which concentrate on that. So, and even to foster kind of, a tradition of history of economic thinking, there are some established HET societies that we find in Europe, in North America, Latin America, and even Japan. So, but it was kind of lacking in India. But over the past few years, thanks to the efforts of some people, we have managed to have some events in this area, and therefore necessity was felt to, establish a platform for scholars. And through that, ISHET, or the Indian Society for the History of Economic Thought, was formally established in September 23, when we were having a first major 3-day workshop and conference on HET at Azim Premji University in Bangalore. So basically, when with the establishment of ISHET, there are a few major aims and goals, such as, creating conditions for research in this area, intellectual histories, history of concepts, in that kind of a sense. It is to create a space where we are able to interact and maybe even train teachers in history of economics, and also create a space for students, especially say graduate scholars who are looking to work in the area. So it's done through holding like the conferences, some talks, and I guess we are planning to make more such kind of interventions in the future, which will create space for more research. So, so far, some of the major events held in the history of economic thought in the past few years have been, there was the SRAFA workshop, which was held last year. We have also had at the Center for Development Studies, and we have had conferences. And of course, the first major conference was held last September. And now this coming October 2024, we will have the first formal ISHET held conference at Hyderabad University. So, of course, I would urge people here to kind of keep an eye out for that and also apply for it well. So, of course, as far as ideas and ISHET together are concerned, we are interested in building a greater institutional collaboration between the two so that we can have research and outreach in different realms of EHET, also such as teaching, teaching and pedagogy, curriculum studies, having general discussions around the area, creating space for more intellectual histories to be developed. So these are some of the aims of our institutional collaboration. And towards this end, especially with regards to curriculum and pedagogy, we plan to hold a more intensive workshop in the future, which of course you all will be kept aware of, and we will be disseminating that information. And kind of the idea is that especially AGT is a particularly interdisciplinary field. And in fact, that is also evident from the symposium participants today who are coming from different disciplines. We have historians, we have political scientists who are part of the discussion today, of course, and also economists. So the idea is to foster these kind of engagements, interactions, and research. I would also urge the participants, if you want to get more news about ideas, events, and also to get a sense of what the Understanding Indian Economy Constellation is planning to work on, then do subscribe to Ideas newsletters. That way you will be made more aware of the events and programs as they are being held. And kind of lastly, before I will hand over to Alex to shortly begin the keynote lecture, I would also, on behalf of ISHET, we want to thank the Ideas organizing team who have made this entire symposium possible, putting in, taking care of the logistics to making all this happen. We would like to extend thanks to Dipanshu Mohan as the Dean for really encouraging this symposium to take place and having work in HET build up in the Understanding Indian Economy Constellation. We want to thank Paulami Bhadra for taking care of a lot of the work that has made this symposium possible. And of course, also thank the constellation members of the Understanding Indian Economy, who have also contributed towards making this particular symposium possible. Okay, so with that, I would kind of move into introducing Alex Thomas today, who is going to be delivering the keynote lecture for us for this opening event of Ideas and ISHET. So just to introduce Alex briefly, Alex M. Thomas is an associate professor of economics at Azim Premji University, Bangalore. He is also currently serving on the Council of the European Society for the History of Economic Thought, that's ESHET. And of course, he's also one of the founding members of the Indian Society for the History of Economic Thought. Alex, in the past few years, has also made some vital publications in this realm. And in 2019, along with Ajit Sinha, he co-edited this volume called Pluralistic Economics and Its History, which was published by Routledge. And he has also published a book called Macroeconomics and Introduction, which is meant as a good reader for Indian students and an introduction to macroeconomics, which is combining examples from India and it's trying to show its relevance in this in the Indian context. So it's a vital intervention in this field. So with that, I would like to hand over the stage to Alex, who will deliver his keynote address to us.
Thank you so much, Sharmin. I'm actually very delighted to be here, but here is, of course, Bangalore in my home. But still, I mean, digitally to be present with all of you, and especially a huge thanks to Mrinalini and Avanindra for holding this. And I must say that before I share the slides, it's also, I think that given that history of economic thought is marginalized, I think it's very important that we situate it also within understanding Indian economy. And I think in from that standpoint, I really appreciate the fact that you've located HET within the Indian economy constellation. Okay, I think I need the screen sharing privileges. It's as of now not enabled.
Oh, just a second.
Yeah.
It should be working right now.
Yeah, it works now. I hope all of you can see my slides in full screen. So I've titled it Economist Amnesia, HET as an Antidote. I mean, partly these keynote lectures supposed to, I think, provoke maybe a little bit, but of course not provoke you too much. So let me begin. And given that my aim in this lecture is going to, I mean, it's intended for a wide variety of audience, which might include students who are doing their BA to advanced PhD students to practitioners and colleagues of economics. And the way in which I'm situating economics is to see it in the realm of policy making, in the context of research, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the different methods that are used by economists and also in teaching. Given this, I want to really focus more of my attention in this talk on BA and MA economics. And the reason for that is the following, because very few actually go on to do a PhD. And therefore, the curriculum in and of itself becomes important. And very often, when we talk about, let's say, BA economics or MA economics and the economics that is taught there, the response that is given is that, but that is not where the frontier of the discipline is. And I think that this is absolutely true. But given that the frontier of the discipline and the limitations of mainstream economics has not really trickled down into our BA and MA economics curriculum, I think that it is still very important to talk about what happens at this level. And just to motivate that a little further, many people, many students who do their MA economics might go on to work in the RBI, in different policy institutions, in different NGOs, in different corporate sectors. And I think that given all this, it is extremely important that there is still attention that is focused on what gets taught in BA and MA economics. I want to spend a little bit of time on economic methods. This, of course, it evokes all kinds of different responses in us. And given that today, I think as most of us are aware, it is certainly the time of the applied economists. Given that most people work in econometrics, and particularly there is a lot of demand for causal econometrics, I think that that is one big economic method that is being used by economists, and it's also being taught in economics programs. But within applied, I also want to highlight the role of field work, which I think probably is now the importance is slightly reduced in the overall hierarchy of things, but we still need to recognize that. There is work in theory that happens across different paradigms in economics. And I mean, I'm sort of proposing history of economic thought as a different economic method itself here. And I'm drawing on Cristina Marcuzzo's 2008 journal article, where she talks about many methods, but I just want to highlight two methods here, which are called rational reconstruction and textual exegesis. So this is just to indicate that within economic methods, there are many. You could be doing econometrics of various kinds. You could be doing field work. You could be doing theoretical work, or you could be doing history of economic thought. And within that too, there are different methods. I have put applied and causal in in quotes to highlight that if one looks at the philosophy of science literature or the philosophy of economics literature, you notice that there are many different definitions and theories of what it means to what causation means. And given that as students of economics, we don't really have philosophy of science in our curriculum, history and philosophy of science, we don't really get an understanding that causality has been historically defined and understood in so many different ways. Whereas today in econometrics, there seems to be a way of understanding causality. And this book by Cartwright, I think, is a very important book. And she in this book also engages with economics. And I want to maybe, spend few seconds to read out this quote from the Nobel laureate in physics, Weinberg, because I think it's also relevant to how we understand our discipline today. The fact that the standards of scientific success shift with time does not only make the philosophy of science difficult, it also raises problems for the public understanding of science. We do not have a fixed scientific method to rally around and defend. So if I were to change the signs in this quote with economics, I think the quote still holds true, except that the last sentence might need to be altered because it looks like we do have a fixed scientific method to rally around and defend. And today it might be a particular way of doing causal econometrics. Tomorrow it might be something else. But what history of economics allows us to do is to understand that at different points in time, there have been different methods that have gained popularity. And here I also want to maybe just plug in this book by Paul Feyerabend, who's a philosopher of science, called Again's Method. And the principal claim in that work of his is that even within practitioners of science who do physics or who do biology or chemistry, people claim that there was one scientific method. And Feyerabend's argument is that no, there are multiple methods that scientists use. And I think this recognition becomes important because this then has to trickle down into our teaching and also in the kinds of research pathways that are available for both students and researchers. So again, economic methods, I want to highlight here the plurality of economic methods, which needs to be underscored in both our curriculum and research. So now I'm going to get into a little bit, try to break down the study of microeconomics and macroeconomics and what I mean by amnesia of a certain kind. This is very well known. I think that it's unfortunate that Varian and Mankiw get a lot of criticisms, but it's also true that they have written one of the most popular books in microeconomics, which are used worldwide. But what is these textbooks of microeconomics telling us? One, they are offering us a theory of the consumer, and they're also offering us a theory of the firm. And there's also discussion on externalities, sometimes on game theory and related matters. This quote by Samuelson is extremely popular, and I'm sure that many of members in the audience know this. And let me read this out. Paul Samuelson writes, "Let those who will write the nation's laws, if I can write its textbooks." Right? It's very clear, as I've mentioned before, the teaching of economics is central because people who are trained in these kinds of modes of thinking go on to do various things in policy realm or in research or in the corporate sector in various ways, or just directly deciding who to vote for when the elections are around the corner. What microeconomics offers, and I'm going to just make it slightly differently, put it differently, is that it allows us to talk about what determines prices. It gives us a theory of wages and profits. It also talks about competition. It also talks about markets. But if that is the case, then there have been many economists who have contributed to talking about prices. And in the abstract to this lecture, I had mentioned Piero Sraffa's work, and I'll talk a little bit about him later. There have been many other thinkers who have spoken about competition. For instance, Karl Marx has spoken about competition. But the question remains, why is it that we do not, let's say, include the work of Marx or the work of Sraffa in microeconomics? And here I want to again introduce you and just briefly, very briefly really, to talk about there exists different ways to teach microeconomics. For instance, this book by Fred Lee is titled Microeconomic Theory, a Heterodox Approach, which is largely inspired by the work of Keynes, Keletsky, Sraffa, and who are called post-Keynesian economists. And this book by Fabio Petri, it is an advanced book. It's not a book for BA students. I think it's a book for PhD students, where he juxtaposes marginalist microeconomics, which is what is commonly taught in Varian and Mankiw, and provides an alternative to understand microeconomics coming from the tradition of Sraffa and other political economists. So again, the question to ask is, if one is writing its textbooks, are you making it very clear that this actually includes all the diverse traditions of doing economics, or are you communicating only a tradition of doing economics, which also in this context happens to be the popular one? Some elements about the history of microeconomics itself, and especially teaching. Very often, Leontief and the fixed coefficient production function is mentioned, but it's really there as an exception. It's there, or you mention Veblen's conspicuous consumption. So anything that unsettles the core logic of marginalist microeconomics is kept to an exception, and maybe nowadays those are also not really taught. But it is very, very highly unlikely that I've not seen a book on microeconomics really talking about the history of microeconomics and tying it to the history of utilitarianism, the political philosophy of utilitarianism. And when you talk about utilitarianism, it is important that we recognize that methodologically the individual becomes at the center. So methodological individualism. And that is one way to do economics, but there are other approaches which reject methodological individualism and would prefer methodological holism. And so, even within the history of microeconomics, and microeconomics textbooks do not tell us enough about at least these kinds of contextual histories, especially the political philosophy of utilitarianism. And given that, I think that the distinction that is often made in Econ 101 between positive and normative economics, I think is not really tenable, because what people think, or the idea of normative economics is what should happen, and positive economics is what is happening. But what should happen in the past influence what is happening today. So if you're able to bring in time or history in a central way, this kind of a distinction between positive and normative economics breaks down. Of course, it also is unable to incorporate elements of ethics and ethical considerations into economic thinking. Now, sometimes when we talk about microeconomics, most of the microeconomics that we learn today is drawing from a little bit from Jevons, Walras, Marshall, Pigou, and of course, very much from Samuelson. But I just want to mention here, if you look at it a little more historically, the fact of the matter is that these elements of thinking in terms of utility, these elements of thinking in terms of margins, a tendency to the full employment of labor, these thoughts that we today associate with marginalist economics, or some often called neoclassical economics, has also been there in the 1800s. Now, this is to say that since Adam Smith or since David Ricardo is writing, competing ideas or competing paradigms have always existed. Yes, we very often talk about the consolidation or the emergence of marginalist economics to the 1870s, but elements of marginalist thinking existed previously. But it is since the 1870s that we see the dominance of marginalist economics within the history of economic thought. And just to highlight again that the competition certainly in the 1800s was with classical political economy, which was offering a different way of understanding our economic surroundings. And certainly in the 1870s and the 1920s, later Samuelson's work, there is a dominance of marginalist economics, but this has not meant that other traditions do not survive. There is ample work which are happening in other traditions, and I will talk a little bit about that. And this kind of, this slide is also to reject the view that sometimes history of economic thought is HET is taught in a linear fashion, which is to say that in 1800s you had Smith, Ricardo, in 1870s Jevons, Walras, and Menger came, and their theories were better, so people went on to adopt their theories, and that is not the case at all. So this brings me to the question, what about other traditions in economics? So one is certainly the Kenney, Smith, Ricardo tradition, or the classical political economy tradition. There is a very rich tradition inspired by the work of Karl Marx, also associated with the labor theory of value, and a tradition of economics which is ongoing in that area. And I must also mention here that both Smith and Ricardo also had certain labor theories of value, different from Marx, but similar. Sraffa in the 1960s has a price theory, well developed. Again, the question, as I asked before, but we don't hear about Marx's labor theory of value, which is also a theory of price. Similarly, Sraffa's is also a theory of price, but we do not confront them. We do not engage with their ideas in our microeconomics classrooms. So this is the book by Sraffa, which is titled Production of Commodities by Means of Commodities, a prelude to a critique of economic theory. And what he meant by that was that he was advancing certain critiques of marginalist economics, but in his work, there are also some critiques of Marx, there are also critiques of classical economics. There are people who have been inspired by Sraffa's work and have working in that tradition, one of which is Silos Labini, his work and Theory of the Firm. So this book, again, when we look at microeconomics books, it is not surprising, of course, but it's only the mainstream or the author of that book, what they think is the mainstream, that gets reflected. So when it comes down to students are getting a very myopic and a very selective view of what constitutes economics. Now, this work, which is about the economics of the rate of profit by Dumenil and Levy, also subtitled Competition, Crisis, and Historical Tendencies in Capitalism. Again, why is it that we do not teach what determines the rate of profit in a microeconomics classroom? And this is a more recent work by Anwar Sheikh, who's also writing in the tradition of classical political economy and Marx, where he's providing empirical evidence, theoretical conceptions to talk about microeconomic behavior as well as macroeconomic behavior. Again, when we look at our curriculum or what gets taught in our BA and MA in economics, it's still very much determined by marginalist microeconomics. I want to spend a little bit time, not too long, but talk about the political implications, because as I mentioned earlier, the way in which marginalist microeconomics is taught to us is as if it is positive economics. It tells us what is and no questions of what should be. And although macroeconomics, people recognize, has a lot of political implications because the government has to decide how much to tax, how much to provide subsidies, or what should the rate of interest be. The political implications of microeconomics, I believe, are at least not highlighted as much. And I want to point attention to something more elementary than, let's say, some kind of conflict between individuals, which is how do we understand competition and how do we conceptualize competition? In marginalist microeconomics, it is conceptualized using the concept of perfect competition. I've put versus free competition because in the work of, say, Smith, Ricardo, and Marx, there's a different notion of competition, which is quite different from perfect competition. And in fact, as students of economics, we know that perfect competition is anything but competitive. It's absolutely a static system, the way it is defined. However, many people who have learned about perfect competition go on again to do policy making. So, how does this understanding of perfect competition have an impact on competition law? And in India, the Competition Commission of India actually makes use of some of these very problematic concepts from marginalist economics. So lawyers also use mainstream economics. How is industrial policy determined? How is trade policy determined? All of this have some connection with how we understand perfect competition. And here I just want to mention the work of my friend Lima Walling in 2022, where he tries to bring together different theories of competition from Austrian tradition, from the classical tradition, and from the marginalist tradition, and to draw out the implications. And this also means that it enriches our understanding of competition, because depending on the school of thought, you have thought about competition differently, and which means that your policy conclusions and your policy implications also vary. Now, I want to go to the question of minimum wages. And this is a very commonly maybe taught and studied diagram in microeconomics. So what it essentially says is that if you have a minimum wage, and because, I mean, this is also set within the supply and demand tradition of thinking. If you have a minimum wage, what it actually does is that it leads to unemployment. Now, this is coming from a particular way of thinking about microeconomics, which is coming from the marginalist tradition. And this is not the case in other traditions. Of course, now you have applied work which says that it's not the case, or you bring in imperfections into the model and you say it's not the case. But most people who are getting a basic degree in economics go with this kind of understanding, and they go on to maybe do various kinds of policies in businesses. Now, again, as I mentioned, the question of minimum wages is absolutely central. It has wide ramifications in how minimum wages policy is determined, how labor laws are determined. And I've traced out some of these issues in a short encyclopedia article which in 2023, which is titled The Political Economy of Wages. Now, moving on to the study of macroeconomics. Again, no surprises there, but Mankiw has written a book on macroeconomics too. And many of these principles align with the principles of microeconomics. And generally, the structure of macroeconomics is like this, that we are taught what is classical macroeconomics, wherein there is price flexibility and a tendency to the full employment of labor. Then we are taught ISLM model, which is said to be a Keynesian model, where there is a role for fiscal policy to increase employment. And then we're taught a host of new Keynesian macroeconomic models. And just like I mentioned in the case of microeconomics, what macroeconomics provides us with is a theory of output, a theory of employment, and a theory of price level. But again, like I asked, is this the only way of doing macroeconomics? Is this the only tradition of doing macroeconomics? And also, now there are so many debates about this, that what is the essence of Keynes's economics? And the funny thing about classical macroeconomics in one way is that it has got nothing to do with classical economics or classical political economy understood as the work of Smith, Ricardo, and Marx. ISLM has got, well, something to do with Keynes, but not majorly, because it is the intellectual invention of John Hicks. New Keynesian macroeconomics, people argue, has got nothing to do with Keynes because it is primarily marginalist macroeconomics, but given a different name. Right? So although these terms have classical Keynesian, they don't necessarily have analytical connections with those traditions. Now, this book that I've mentioned here tries to provide an exposition of Keynes's economics and extends Keynes's ideas to the long run. So you can ask questions about growth and accumulation if one is interested by drawing on this work. What about the history of macroeconomics? Again, I'm only going to talk about some very select points. Historically speaking, I mean, there have been two different ways of thinking about macroeconomics if you think about a theory of output. One, which is the marginalist way, which is to say that savings at full employment gets equilibrated with investment through variations in the rate of interest. And the rate of interest is determined then by either by some theory of the loanable funds or sometimes today by the rate of time preference. Right? So that's the mainstream new Keynesian idea. The principle of effective demand, which was put forth by the work of Keynes and also independently by the work of Kalitsky and further developed by Joan Robinson, Kaldor, and others, talks about the relationship between investment and saving very differently. As you can see, conceptually, the causation runs from investment to saving via variations in output levels, and there is no tendency to the full employment of labor. Now, this is a fundamental difference, and I think most of macroeconomics can be understood this way. Now, if one is interested in the work of Joan Robinson, you can look at this. And I want to raise this question of, again, go back a little bit in history and ask the question, what is classical economics? Because as I already mentioned, the way in which macroeconomics textbooks talk about classical economics is as if it is like marginalist economics. And I think that textbooks have got it wrong. And here, Sharman mentioned my book in the introduction, but I just want to mention that in my macroeconomics book, what I try to do is to provide a comparison between classical economics and marginalist economics and how, and in the tradition of, when I say classical economics, it is Smith, Ricardo, and Marx, along with Keynes and Straffa, how that kind of a tradition provides us insights into various macroeconomic behavior and how that contrasts with marginalist macroeconomics that we often learn in ManQ and other popular mainstream textbooks. Again, the question of when we think of classical economics and the role of demand, because of the way in which macroeconomics books teach us and the assumption of Say's law, in my own research in the history of economic thought, I wanted to ask this question: did they have any recognition that demand plays some sort of a constraining role? And in this paper that is published in the Review of Political Economy, I point out that there are elements of thought in the work of many of these classical economics, classical economists, which highlight the role of something like constraining role for demand. Now, what did political economists or classical political economists broadly have to say on the macro question? Now, already I mentioned that Marx has a theory of labor theory of value, and has a theory of competition, which can be taught in microeconomics courses, but it's not taught. Okay, fine. But what about the macro questions? Marx has written about money. Marx has written about production. He has discussions on growth and reproduction. He has discussions on economic crisis. And actually, when the global financial crisis happened, if one were a heterodox economist who was working in any of these traditions, you had a better sense of how to understand the crisis and have policy recommendations for the crisis, right? But again, we don't teach Marx in macroeconomics either. And then I was interested in this question of, again, as I mentioned, the question of demand, but more specifically in the work of Smith and Ricardo. And if I were to ask the question of growth, Adam Smith on the question of economic growth, Ricardo on the question of economic growth, what is it that they say? So for Smith, it is very clear that division of labor or technological progress has a role to play. Saving/investment has a role to play, and extent of the market, some kind of a demand constraint has a role. Right? So if you ask, if somebody who reads Smith, They know very clearly that if you want economic growth, you need technological progress, you need investment, and you need a market that grows. Now, Ricardo added to Smith's understanding by also highlighting the diminishing returns to land. Now, broadly speaking, some kind of an ecological constraint. So if you have technological progress that can offset the diminishing returns to land, there is a way to have economic growth. Like, again, another kind of amnesia which I want to highlight here, and the question, I'm leaving it as an open question to you. What additional insights about economic growth does Solow and Romer provide, especially in their Nobel contributions, the contribution that was recognized by the Nobel awarding committee? Right? Because if it is to say that technological progress matters for growth, it's already there clearly in Adam Smith. Right? If it is to say that endogenous technological progress matters, it's also there in Smith and Ricardo. Now, if it is to say that you want to integrate ecology in some way, the diminishing returns to land idea is already there in Ricardo. Right? So if one is interested in this, one can look at Heinz Kutz and Neri Salvadori's work in 1999. Again, there's a certain kind of amnesia where we happen to reinvent the wheel over and over again. And we are also in the habit of awarding Nobel Prizes to them. Now, circling back to what is economics and the definition of economics, because I spoke about the importance of talking about these things in the context of education. And this happens not just at the college level or the university level, but very much in the school level. So what happens in the school level is you're given a definition that is given of economics by Adam Smith, by Ricardo, by Marshall, by Samuelson. And then as this quote tells you, you are said that Samuelson's definition is the best definition. So again, what is being told from a very young age is that a linear kind of view of scientific progress within economics. So Samuelson's definition is better than all the other definitions of economics. Now, suppose you have a course in history of economic thought. There might be two ways to teach history of economic thought, and I've looked at many textbooks which, some which do this, or one is a very cumulative view, which is that you teach Smith, Ricardo, Marx, Marshall, and as if Marshall is an improvement over Ricardo, Samuelson is an improvement over Marshall, and of course, your textbook is an improvement over everything else, because that's the only thing that we read. Right? That's the cumulative view, which I think is problematic, because what I've tried to show so far is that there are multiple paradigms, there are contending paradigms, and we cannot really say that the work of Marshall is an improvement over the work of Ricardo, because they're operating with very different conceptual categories. So as I mentioned, multiple paradigms is the reality. And while I was reading this for another piece of writing, I came across Sukhomoy Chakravarti, who I think many of us will know is instrumental in planning. Right? And I've just given this book here with a short, small picture. Right? He writes that when he was studying in Calcutta University, again, Calcutta University was teaching everything that was mainstream, but he also had history of economic thought. So the way he was exposed to history of to classical political economy and Marx was because history of economic thought was there in the curriculum. And if you are interested in the biography of Sukhomoy Chakravarti, you can look at this biographical dictionary of dissenting economists. Again, the question to ask is, who within economics is doing this work? It's people who are primarily interested in the history of economics, and there's a particular method to engage with this. They are the ones who are bringing these ideas together. And since I've mentioned this biographical dictionary of dissenting economists, I also want to highlight this Edward Elgar book on women economists, where the editors have put together a compilation of biographical details on women economists. Again, in many of our histories or in our curriculum, even though women have contributed to many of these ideas, they are not adequately engaged with. And I think that this is a point that I want to make here, that the burden of history cannot fall on the history of economic thought course alone. Because for one, if there is a course, you just have one course in the entire curriculum. It might be an elective or it might be a compulsory course, but either way, it's just one course, one single course. And I think that the historical approach has to be embedded in our pedagogy so that it can be done in courses on micro, in econometrics, in mathematics, etc. I don't think that it makes sense to do it only within history of economic thought, because in history of economic thought, we also want to teach students the method of doing HET, which could be rational reconstruction or textual exegesis or historical reconstruction. So research continues in multiple paradigms, but, and I think this is where I think that both students and teachers, we are at a fix, because journal rankings matter for university rankings, they matter for promotions, they matter for visibility, they matter for grant applications and everything. So there is that. But here I want to share this, I think, always the relevant quote from Marx. The ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. That is, the ideas which is the ruling material force of society is at the same time its ruling intellectual force. So if you look at the journal rankings, if you work in history of economic thought, because history of economic thought is not mainstream, it will never be in the top A star or AAA journal ranking, right? So there is an internal hierarchy within economics that marginalizes history of economic thought and people who work in marginalized traditions within economics. It could be the method that you use, it could be the theory that you use, it could be the paradigm that you work in. And I think that these heterodox traditions, broadly understood in opposition to the mainstream, question status quo. And I think the other thing is that what history of economic thought also does is that the political implications of many of these ideas that are taught in marginalist microeconomics is also laid bare in history of economic thought course. I'm moving towards the end of my presentation. I think I've got a couple of slides. That's about it. I wanted to provide some samples of history of economic thought journals, and I've starred some of these because they are not history of economic thought journals, but they broadly, broadly publish in various heterodox traditions. So Review of Political Economy, Cambridge Journal of Economics, but European Journal of History of Economic Thought, History of Political Economy, Journal of History of Economic Thought. So there are many history of economic thought journals if one wants to publish. Of course, they do not make it to the top ranking, because the ranking is anyway determined by people who are working in a different paradigm with a certain internal hierarchy of what constitutes as good economics. Here, this brings me to the question of, I mean, maybe using a very strong word for this, but intellectual unfreedom. Now, what do I mean by that? Now, suppose a student or any person, any economist is interested to answer this question: what did Adam Smith think about economic development? Now, it requires an HET approach. You cannot do field work. You cannot do econometrics. Right? But now, if you try to do an HET approach and the journal, it gets published in an HET journal, it does not go into the rankings and it has various effects. So you are constrained by these journal rankings and other sociology of knowledge production in economics. But I really think what we are doing, well, intentionally or otherwise, is that I think we are restricting the scope of human ingenuity by deciding what is good economics. And good in quotes, in stars, because very often it depends on the method that is being used. It depends on the paradigm that you are working in. And it's not necessarily on what is the most appropriate method to deal with a certain question. And since that this is the last really slide, since we are, the symposium is primarily about the history of Indian economic thought, I just wanted to talk a little bit about it. Since I'd published a critical survey of recent histories of Indian economic thought in the Japanese Journal for the History of Economic Thought, and where I highlighted 2 points. And I think the study of Indian economic thought can be done very well within the larger history of economic thought tradition. And I think that there's a lot of cross-fertilization possible between people who are interested in Indian economy and history of economic thought. But I want to problematize the idea of Indian a little bit here, which is one, I mean, how do we define an Indian? And is it connected to the idea of the nation state? Is it to the geographical, is it to how the geography is defined? Is it that they studied in an Indian university, or did they study abroad? Or is it that they wrote about Indian issues? But I want to mention just two people here. I mean, among the many that I've highlighted. So P.J. Thomas in the 1930s, 40s applied Keynes's ideas to India, so specificities of the Indian context. And Krishna Bharadwaj used specificities of the Indian context to produce global economic ideas and concepts, and this is the idea of the interlinked markets. And just to mention, I am not related to E.M. Thomas or to P.J. Thomas by any stretch. I mean, people often think that is the case, but no, that's not the case. Thank you so much. And just one last, I mean, partly the inspiration for using this term amnesia comes from this work by G.N. Devi, which is a work on literary criticism, where it's really talking about how we have forgotten our own history. We have forgotten Indian economists who have contributed. We have forgotten, let's say, classical economists who have contributed. We have forgotten women economists who have contributed. So we're just happy with erasing, we're just happy with memory loss. And we're happy to think that we've produced new ideas. And I think history of economic thought helps us contain our memory loss to a large extent. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Alex, for that wonderfully illustrative talk. In fact, kind of, I mean, I think that, and even while looking at the title of your talk, I think that as you use that term amnesia, I think it was a particularly evocative term, and I'm glad you kind of brought that in. And I love that kind of the extensive kind of way in which you traced the history of economic thought, and also in terms of teaching and how there are aspects of parts of economics that have become more mainstream, and in that sense texts and textbooks are so crucial towards that. So it was interesting to kind of bring that perspective in. Of course, I don't have very many comments really, in the sense of the extensive kind of journey you took us through economic theory as well. But what I can say from coming from my own field and all, I guess the kind of points that really struck me were more towards the beginning of your talk, when you were mentioning this aspect of the plurality of methods in science itself, and of course that kind of permeates the debate on economic methods as well. So whether, as you said, whether it's methodological individualism or methodological holism, and I mean, interestingly enough, even science itself and the natural sciences also struggle to kind of find a fixity in terms of methods, and even defining what are dominant approaches. And naturally, and since the social sciences and especially economics does kind of try to take that on also to a great extent, it's I mean, it is very interesting. And the part is that we know even economics actually traces a lot of its origins to science, right? I mean, especially I think some of the earliest proponents who we consider when we study the history of political economy and all were doctors or physicists and all. So that language has kind of come to be part of our economics as well. And in fact, one more point, and also at this point, I would urge everyone in the audience to also drop in their questions in the Q&A box, which Alex will address. Yeah, and coming to my, just the second observation, which I found, which was interesting, was your discussion on Hal R. Varian's textbook on microeconomics. Interestingly enough, I just I got this other fact about Hal Varian is that he was the chief economist of Google, right? And Hal Varian has written some interesting documents as well. And in fact, it's interesting to see how economists and the way in which the contemporary world and say the use of data, especially, and big data has been spoken of. And it reminded me of how Shoshana Zuboff in her work on surveillance capitalism quotes Varian extensively to see how he's talking about how Google and other big data companies, kind of are looking at commodifying private data, using it, analyzing it. And also, it's just something that struck out to me, that in the sense that how economics, especially amongst most of the social sciences and economists, have usually been amongst those who are closest to the policy fields, and especially as advisors, because in a sense, it's seen as one of the most of the social sciences, it's seen as being one of the most technical, one of the most ahistorical, and also just maybe if you could briefly comment on that, and then hopefully we should be getting in some more questions from the audience as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Shaman. So just, yeah, let me briefly respond to that. One is the relationship with sciences, and I think, I didn't really mention that too much in the presentation, but yes, Kenne was a surgeon. And many of those people, of course, engaged in multiple fields of study. But I think, most pertinent maybe for our purposes would be the relationship with physics and engineering in the 1870s, with Jevons being inspired by that, Walras also being inspired. And I think economics sort of moving from, earlier it was called political economy, to economics itself, and even the change in nomenclature suggesting something like you're being like physics, or you want to be more like the natural sciences. So people have written about how, even the role of mathematics, but also the engagement with sciences has changed that. And I would say maybe even today, the entire randomized control trials, or the RCT, the RCT revolution in a particular way, if you think about it, medical sciences, of course, used it extensively. The RCT approach and the way in which we want to think of controls and treatment also is coming from medical sciences. And I think that there's a lot more interrelationship between the methods that are developed in the sciences and what we take on. But the issue is both, I think, within the sciences and the practitioners of science and the practitioners of economics, is that I think there's very less engagement with, let's say, the history and philosophy of medicine or the ethics of medicine. Similarly, in the economics context, there is very less engagement with the history and philosophy of economics, as well as the ethics of economics. So we do not have these in our curriculum, and they need to be much more integrated within, I think, our curriculum and different courses that we do. And to your second point about, that's very interesting, and I shall take a look at that book on surveillance capitalism, because it's true. And actually, I think what the point that I wanted to make, which I don't think I explicitly said, is the way in which people think about competition has an impact on competition law, but also has an impact on how you view markets. So the solution for most of the people who have come from this perfect competition, marginless tradition, is that if there is a problem, create a market for it. So you have a problem with environment, let's have a market for carbon credits, right? You have a problem where there is inadequate, I think, kidneys, you create a kidney market. So, you have a problem. So whatever the problem is, the solution seems to be by setting up a market. But I don't think setting up a market by itself is an issue, but how you design the market. What principles are you going to employ? And I think this needs to be carefully thought about. And whether you want to base it on the atomistic individual efficiency, rationality, maximizing, methodological individualist position, or do we want to look at other traditions where they have theories of the firm, where you have pricing decisions? So I think that what we see is a lack of engagement with competing frameworks, even when we are talking about big data. And the point that you made, which I find, that's what I think requires economists to be most critical because of the proximity to the policy arena. And I think this is all the more reason why I think economists should necessarily have a training in ethics, should have a training in history and philosophy of science and economics, because of that proximity. Now, if you are doing something just simply for intellectual fascination, I think that it's probably okay. You don't know enough about ethical considerations. But I think that this particular angle, I would say, makes that connect a little stronger. And one last point, again, even in the context of big data, and I mean, I actually taught a basic course on statistics in society. And what we tried to do in that course was to spend a lot of time looking at how data is generated and the ethics of that process. And I remember teaching them or aspects of this book called Data Feminism, because feminist critique, which is about the question of power, needs to be brought into the question of big data, because very often we are just happy to be users of data, but how is this data actually being produced? So I think there's a lot of very interesting things that can be said about the history of measurement, the history of statistics, history of data.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that response, Alex. We've got a couple of questions from the audience. So maybe what I do is first place one or two questions or so to you, and you can answer. We have just about 5 minutes left in the session, so try to get in as many as we can. So just the first question is, where would you place the credibility of the empirical revolution in the broader context of the history of economic thought? Then another, the second question is that how do we is there a problematization in terms of bringing diverse scholars in the within Indian economic thought to the fore? And they're saying especially because there is a diversity of languages and all, which also kind of affects the way in which economists are perceived and received. So the question says, for example, the reception of Srafa was different amongst Indian scholars. So I guess asking about the diversity within the diversity in the reception of economists within India, and also coming from different cultural linguistic backgrounds. I can perhaps add in the third question as well, which I think you can combine all of them. This one is asking in the sense that one of the complications in terms of pluralizing the teaching of economics is that a lot of initial effort needs to go into defining the boundaries of economics, which is, say, for example, finance and business, and especially that kind of economics which is taught at an introductory elective course, say in engineering colleges, where I guess it is like a one paper or so. So keeping that in mind, does the intervention of introducing pluralism need to start earlier than the college level, say at the high school level? Or can it, or does that become too complex a project, both from an organizational perspective and syllabus perspective? So I guess, where does it really start and how do you fit it into different molds? Right. So these three questions.
So I have 5 minutes and I have 3.
Yes.
So this is like the rapid fire round. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Let me try. So let me start with the third question first. And I think I agree with you that the pluralism has to start at an early level. And I think this is what, I mean, sometimes when I've tried to communicate this about pluralism, people respond by saying, oh, the students will get confused. But I think that this is not the truth, because in school, well, we have to learn different languages to understand our physical surroundings. We have to learn physics, we have to learn chemistry, we have to learn biology. That itself is 3 different paradigms or frameworks of understanding the same thing, or different parts of the same thing. Similar to, so we are breaking down human knowledge into various chunks to be able to understand it. And when we have the same phenomena being explained by two paradigms, I think it helps us understand both those paradigms better. And so I think that certainly I would say we are trained to understand this from a younger age, to make sense of the world, however complex and puzzling it might be. So yes, to pluralism, absolutely. To the question of the credibility revolution, one, I will just direct you to the work of Beatrice Cherrier, who has written about the history of empirical economics and all that. But let me just give you my own view on this. If you take a look at what was dominant in, let's say, the 1970s onwards to now, people in India, at one point, everybody worked on general equilibrium. That was fashionable. Then people worked on game theory. That was fashionable. Then there was a point where people worked on time series econometrics with the stock market data and all that. That was fashionable. Right? So it keeps changing. And of course, I mean, people like us who are alive today like to think that we are doing the best, right? So it's also a certain kind of set. I mean, so I think that if you look at it in a historical trajectory, fashions have always existed in economics. It has always been fashionable to do one thing or the other, and they keep changing. I don't think anything is permanent that way because there are ebbs and flows in that. To the question about diversity and Indian economic thought. So one is that, I mean, there are two things here. I think because history of economic thought is not really taken as a way that, let's say, you can do a PhD in, and there's not enough training given to that. And we want to change that with such kind of initiatives as we are doing today, which is that where do you do this kind of work? And even if you do it, I mean, how do you have a critical perspective towards it? Right? This is not to say that if whatever PJ Thomas wrote is a good thing necessarily. There are problems with anything that everyone has written, right? Whether it's Marx or Straffa or PJ Thomas. But we have an additional responsibility, which is that people have written in regional languages too, vernacular languages. So, which means that translation becomes important, or you need to know multiple languages. Again, I think that we need to have maybe workshops or courses which enable translations to happen both ways. That is, from foreign languages to vernacular languages, as well as vernacular languages to other languages, so that we have a better appreciation. And I mean, this is a question, and this last point, and I'll end here. I asked this question to students. I mean, how many Indian economists do you study, actually seriously study? Maybe Amartya Sen is probably the only one. But so this is a big issue because we don't teach contributions made by Indian economists itself. And that is because we rely on textbooks which are primarily foreign, perhaps, or written by Indian economists, which are copies of foreign economists, foreign books.
Okay, yeah. Thanks a lot, Alex. And though we have a couple more questions in our Q&A box, but unfortunately, we are out of time and I need to pass on to the next moderator and discussant to speak about Ruchira's paper. But thank you, Alex. And I would also just urge the other attendees, if you do have questions, if possible, do try and place it within the first 5 to 7 minutes of the quick Q&A round, so that we have time to go through them possibly. So yeah, that's all. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sharman. Welcome everyone to the symposium, the Ideas Symposium on the History of Economic Thought. It's a very exciting lineup that we have, a lot of interesting papers, a lot of interesting topics to discuss. I'd like to introduce the next speaker, Dr. Ruchira Sen. Ruchira is faculty at the Jindal School of Journalism and Communication. She's done her PhD from the University of Missouri at Kansas City. And she's got a very interesting paper that, we're all looking forward to reading it. I've already read it and I found it very, very enjoyable, slightly controversial, but like all good academic papers, controversial and exciting. So without further ado, I think I'll open it up to Ruchira, and we'll have about 20-25 minutes of Ruchira's talk, following which I'll give, if there is time, I'll give some brief comments and we can take questions from the audience. Otherwise, we'll go straight to questions from the audience. So yeah, over to you, Ruchira, and perhaps in to you separately, just to have an idea of time. Over to you. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. In the interest of time, I moved very quickly and shared my slides. Thank you, Rahul, for the glowing introduction and the words of encouragement. Sometimes I get worried about the controversy and, the ideas that come out of my own head. I get shocked by them, being from a very conservative culture myself. And then I get scared. And then I think, oh, goodness, why am I thinking about these things? So here we go. Okay, so my paper is on polyamory and abundance. And, the project really, and the aim of the project has been changing quite a few times. But the earlier I started trying to understand how much of Keynes' ideas I can relate to, his polyamorous lifestyle. Of course, earlier I was thinking bisexuality, to which, I think that was the wrong way to go about it. In part because Skidelsky also tries to emphasize that Keynes converted to a heteronormative framework, which, in Skidelsky's own words, was he said that it was more conducive to sustained intellectual effort, and therefore Keynes converted to a heteronormative lifestyle. I don't think that was the case, and I'm trying now to, work around this idea. In part, I'm drawing on Lydia Lopokova's biography by Julia Macrell. But I'm not there yet. But that is what, that is the part of the story of Keynes that irks me. And I feel the urge to try to, connect Keynes's own understanding of his own sexuality and his own experiences in trying to determine how that affects his economics. So, okay, with regard to biography, there are lots of Keynes biographies, actually. It's quite interesting. From Roy Harrod's biography is your very staid account that just sticks to Keynes's professional life. And, Harrod decides to completely take away from Keynes's personal life, in part because this biography was also commissioned by the Keynes family. And they wanted Keynes's intellectual achievements to be separated from his others. Skidelsky, when he wrote his actually 3-volume biography, you can see there's Hopes Betrayed, Economist as Savior, and Fighting for Britain. And then there is the condensed biography, which is Economist, Philosopher, Statesman. There's a couple of other volumes, like this one that's the Essential Keynes. So that is Skidelsky's edited volume of Keynes's own writings. But that's not strictly biographical. I use this to try to find Keynes's voice in all of this. But meanwhile, there are a couple of other non-economist kinds of biographies as well. So there's the Charles Hessian biography, which says that Keynes is more creative because of his bisexual experience, something that many scholars do not actually appreciate because they feel like Hessian has made too many psychotherapeutic or psychological leaps that they can't quite engage with. Mogridge's biography I love, actually. It's my favorite. Many people, of course, prefer Skidelsky to Mogridge. If Alex is still here, I'm told Alex says he likes Clark more than Skidelsky. But though, those discussions are still going on. And then there is a journalistic article by Zachary. I mean, there's a journalistic volume by Zachary Carter where he tries to actually bring Keynes back because he's writing to this post-2008 renewed interest in heterodox economics. How do I change my slide? Now, here are Keynes' sex diaries. This is from the Keynes papers. It's in the personal archive, and it's produced from Carter. What you can see here is actually the number of encounters and with whom. Keynes is quite prolific, as you can see. The various lovers are given from 1901 to 1915. So it starts with Dylan Knox, that was in Eton. Then there are a few years where nothing happens. And then in 1906, I think that's when Keynes is in Cambridge in his apostolic days. GLS is Lytton Strachey. JBS is James Strachey. There are a bunch of other people here. DG comes in, that's Duncan Grant in 1908. And then something happens where, and there's a big argument with Strachey when Keynes is with Duncan because Strachey wanted to be with Duncan. And later on, what later becomes the Bloomsbury ethic, what is polyamorous, the idea of working on your jealousy or not being possessive, not considering love as a property relationship. These are all polyamorous thoughts. Now, Keynes, of course, does not, take on this kind of more Marxist reading of polyamory. Nonetheless, this is where his big discussion with Strachey is happening from 1908 onwards. I'm trying to get my hands on the Strachey Keynes letters. And yeah, I don't know if Avanindra Ideas can help with that. I'm told they haven't been digitized yet, so we have to buy them. Anyhow, so 1908 is when there is this major fight between Keynes and Strachey over Duncan, and they are then evaluating how they think about their own ethic. By 1909, Grant finds other people to be interested in him, and Keynes is then going on, what he thinks of as some sort of like unsafe behavior. And many economists, including his economist colleagues, are telling him now, try that it's illegal, of course, to pursue sodomy and, try to be contained, try not to get into trouble. So there's a lot of people here. There's the stable boy, there's this, lift boy at Vauxhall, etc., etc. So in this process, Keynes also meets a wider variety of friends and associates, which he would not otherwise meet because England is still at that point quite a reasonably classist society, even though Neville Keynes's father was from the working class. Despite that, it is still, somewhat of a classist society. You can see BKS sometime in 1912. That's an Indian student at Cambridge. Anyhow, so this is a closer look at the diaries. They're reproduced from Carter. This is where you can see them better. There's a sculptor of Florence, and he uses these words which make them sound like characters in a spy novel. Mogridge always says, in fact, he says in the preface itself that, a biography is selective. Keynes, he's focused on Keynes's professional activities. The rest are getting covered. What about these things and how do they affect him? And, and he says, what is the point of going boy to boy, from Dilly to Dan to Lytton to James to Hobby? Hobby is Arthur Hobhouse, also about whom he had another fight with Strachey. That's why I want to get hold of those letters. To Duncan, to the stall boy of Park Lane, etc., etc. Why do we care about this? So that brings us to the idea of the Bloomsbury ethic, that, Keynes's sexual encounters are not some seedy underbelly of his life. They are central to his ethic of free human expression and a break from restrictive Victorian morals. And here I want to just read out portions. I haven't been able to write this down, but portions of Keynes's early beliefs. And, most of what he's drawing from G.E. Moore, who is, who was one of the vital philosophers of the apostolic days, or of the Bloomsbury ethic. And Keynes here says, at this point, like, I haven't got this here in the slides, but it's there in the paper, and I'm working on this now. Keynes meets adversary in D.H. Lawrence, who comes one day to meet Bertrand Russell, finds Keynes hanging out there. And he writes to Russell and he says that, I am very against these Cambridge men and their, what he calls higher sodomy, because what is happening with these guys is that they are becoming, like, this process of being with one another is causing them to become more sterile and less manly. Right. And he's basing this from seeing Keynes roaming around in his pajamas. So Keynes later on decides to respond to Lawrence's criticism. And Lawrence also says that they are frivolous. They are only interested in states of mind, that they aren't particularly interested in the real issues of the world, of politics, and so on. So Keynes now responds to it. And interestingly, he responds to it 2 years after he has written the general theory. So this is while he is married to Lydia Lopokova. And he says that we accepted Moore's religion and discarded his morals. Indeed, one of the greatest advantage of religion is that it made morals unnecessary. And then he talks about how he understands the economy. He says that nothing mattered except states of mind. So for Keynes, the economy actually comprises not just material goods, but states of mind, which then ties in with many feminist ideas. Alex was referring to data feminism. Data feminism talks a lot about the role of emotion in, how data is visualized. So Keynes is also bringing in the idea of states of mind. He says nothing mattered except states of mind, our own and other people's, of course, but chiefly our own. These states of mind were not associated with action or achievement or consequences. They consisted in timeless, passionate states of contemplation and communion. And he says, now this is important, he says their value depended in the principle of organic unity, on the state of affairs as a whole, which could not be usefully analyzed into parts. And this, in a way, ties down to his idea of the whole and the parts, how the economy is a whole and not the sum of its parts, which he later, of course, credits to Hobson. From whom he takes the idea of the individualist fallacy, which later, by general theory, becomes his theory of effective demand. Now he starts to say that, for example, the value of the state of mind of being in love did not depend merely on the nature of one's own emotions, but also on the worth of their object and on the reciprocity and nature of the object's emotion, but depended on how one felt about it a year later. He says that, if A was in love with B and believed that B reciprocated his feelings when B did not, but was in love with C, would the state of affairs be as good as it would have been if A had been right? So, of course, this sounds very abstruse, but essentially what he's tying this down to is what Skidelsky calls his adding up problem. The idea of, like, say, I want to do something in my self-interest, Rahul wants to do something in his self-interest, but when we are working together, then the ultimate result is not in the self-interest and is not in the interest of society. The state of mind is not necessarily made better off in that sense. So so that's why there is a need to think about the state of mind as a whole, the economy as a whole. And these ideas he's also taking from many of his colleagues who led similar lives, like Virginia Woolf. When she is writing To the Lighthouse, she is describing the artist's memory and the evocation of emotions, the states of mind, right, and how that plays a role in her art. Vanessa Bell believed, that emotion in like the value of art is the emotion that it evokes in you. In the same sense, the economy also is in a way a sum total not of goods but of emotions, of ethics, and states of mind that creates the economy as a whole. So emotion in economic thought, and this remains this remains a controversial issue as well, because economics is always presented as something dispassionate, something removed from emotion. However, D'Ignazio and Klein, they talk about the role of emotion in data visualization. In this graph, what they do is they ask Democrat sympathizers, they actually ask the same audience, and they present a particular set of data on unemployment rate, and they ask them to visualize it from a Democratic perspective and from a Republican perspective. And here, from a Democratic perspective, they show unemployment rate falling. This was during the Obama years, right? So the Democrats were in power, and they're showing unemployment rate falling. But the Republicans will then emphasize that the unemployment rate is still above 8%. So the question of how you see it, sometimes you will have something that is empirically there, but there is a value of the perspective that you're coming from, or the context that you're coming from, which determines how that data is presented. In that sense as well, for Keynes, he is dealing with Marshall, he is, writing for an economic audience, which does not, want to truck about with beauty and art in the same way as his other friends in Bloomsbury and the Apostles. But at the same time, he has learned the importance of emotion in depiction of any particular evidence, from Woolf, from Bell, from Leonard Woolf, from Lytton Strachey, from Duncan Grant. And he is, coming from that lens. He is seeing that, the economy itself is a sum total of emotions, of states of mind. And in that sense, it becomes important also when we are looking at emotion to try to rearrange our ideas of objectivity. So that's something we can learn from Keynes. He's already done it long before, Dignaggio and Klein are writing, long before feminism is, coming to economics or trying to make changes in economics. So they're saying that we need to think about economics from a viewpoint, I mean, not economics, but anything from a viewpoint of feminist objectivity, which looks at where are people coming from. Or the idea of standpoint rationality. So, it isn't just about being rational or about being dispassionate, but about understanding emotional standpoints. And of course, in philosophy, there is the idea of the uses of emotion, like the erotic in Audre Lorde or anger in Audre Lorde, which comes into being. This now, I mean, I've already skipped several items of my discussion, and skipped several slides. But, this goes back to Keynes's idea of the apostles, like Keynes's group, the apostles, and how they read G.E. Moore and how they tried to understand the role of the good and the economy as a whole. And Keynes also brings emotion in, where he starts looking at uncertainty, and he, tries to understand, do economic actors actually care about what something is really worth, or do they care about how they feel, which then brings in the volatilities of investment and also how the market will respond to any given investment. In the same way as they would respond to valuation of art, they are responding to valuation of investment. And the apostles were also about this idea of higher sodomy. Keynes actually refers to it in My Early Beliefs, where he says that, our religion was not exactly the kind of words that Strachey uses. He says here, yeah, I can't find that right now, but yeah, he says that the love that he's talking about, where the state of a mind of being in love with A, but A is in love with B, what does that affect your state of mind, and so on. He says that the love there is purely platonic. I think he's just saying that also because he's presenting this essay at Tilton in the presence of his wife and so on. He's saying that the idea of love need not necessarily be sexual love, even though Strachey brings in the idea of higher sodomy and why that is the way in which the apostles are expected to live, even when they are in mixed company. They must subscribe to ideas of higher sodomy, and they say that heterosexual relationships like the one of Keynes and Lydia are a special case of this higher sodomy. So there is, the Bloomsbury group also has a special interest in ideas of friendship, or how friendship is the ultimate human relationship, community is the ultimate human relationship. And in that sense, the heterosexual relationships are the special case of that general state of higher sodomy. So Keynes is, in that sense, also thinking of neoclassical economics as a special case of the general theory. So yeah, this goes back to, of course, Keynes and Lawrence and their debate on whether sodomy is sterilizing, whether it makes you less manly and makes you less interested in political affairs. Keynes, when he, in his My Early Beliefs, he does in fact say that his religion saved him from both the utilitarianism of the Benthamite framework, but also Marxism. So, in a way, this is how he comes to perhaps some of the same conclusions as Kaleski, but out of the Marxist system. Yeah, and this is, of course, critiques of early beliefs, where Russell was writing to Ottoline Morel to say that he's trying to talk to Keynes about what is your purpose in life. Is it just about the pursuit of pleasure? So they have a tendency to think of Keynes as utilitarianism, also because he's one of the few economists in their circle. And Keynes then goes on to say that, look, I'm not interested in utilitarianism. What I mean by states of mind is not pleasure, but a general existence of, or a general idea of valuation of economic situations. So that's basically it. There's something here on Bloomsbury and the war. My reviewers have told me to essentially chuck this portion out. But this is an example of how Keynes used very unusual policy making to solve the problem of the run on the pound, which happened during the war. And Yeah, so that's basically it. That was what I was trying to say. I've pretty much done that. But what do we mean? Like, what can we draw from this? Mainly the idea of why it is so important to understand emotion in economic thought, to develop a more inclusive and a more feminist idea of objectivity in the science that we do, and also of understanding human behavior from a more emotion involved idea of objectivity. I'll end here. I hope I stuck to time.
Yeah, thank you, Ruchira. You have stuck to time. Thank you so much for remaining on time. I'll just have a few comments to make, and during the time I make my comments, if those who would like to ask a question to the speaker, if you could just put it down in the Q&A box, and then we'll have a brief discussion, Ruchira and I, not more than say 5 to 10. I think we have 10 minutes left for a discussion, and then after that we can address the questions. I think we have time till 12, so that gives us enough time. So I'll just have a couple of just a brief questions, and I'll restrict myself to the talk, which was an aspect of Keynes's work. It's really a lovely and a very nice way of looking at it, a different way of coming to these questions that most of us who have read, who follow a more originalist interpretation of Keynes rather than the textbook version that has now made itself into macroeconomics textbooks that most of us are familiar with, but it's nice to see it in a different light. So I'll just start with maybe like some specific points and then move over to some general concepts that we could discuss. There's one thing I was interested in the thing that you wrote about, the concept that you spoke about, higher sodomy, but and then therefore neoclassical economics as a special case of the general theory in line with heterosexuality being a special case of sodomy. But I'm not too sure about this because there is some work, and James Galbraith has written about how Keynes was actually inspired by Einstein here, how Einstein was talking about Newtonian physics being the special case of the general theory of relativity. And even in some of Keynes's collected writings, he makes notion to you cannot do Euclidean geometry in a non-Euclidean world. So in this, I'm a little uncomfortable with making the causal link here. I mean, they might have said it in jest, but there's also evidence that Keynes was also inspired by the currents of thought of what Einstein was talking about. So I think there was a little bit of my slight discomfort with that bit there. On the question of emotions, like very interesting, we had this idea of emotions. Mainstream economics now calls it now, I mean, there's a great paper by Christina Romer and David Romer, where they look at central bank speeches and speeches of governors of central bank and how it affects the market. So they are trying to say it's about expectations, it's about the central bank being credible, but at the end, it's also indirectly talking to this notion of the emotions of investors. And so it is also making its way. And the way that you're pinpointing the notion of emotions here is very interesting. But I just want to sort of just put this out there, and how do we interpret these emotions? Because are there two different ways of looking at this? Because you could make the argument that Keynes and the Bloomsbury group heighten the notion of emotions in art, but Keynes is also saying that emotions are a destructive thing in a capitalist economy. So is there a difference in the way that we're looking at emotions? Because the ideal Keynesian notion is, I mean, in his words, you euthanize the rentier, which is we don't want any place for emotions in the economic, but at the same time, it seems that he's okay with emotions in the artistic. So is there a difference then in emotions? How do we look at those emotions? Because you could talk about emotions as being a state of mind, and he recognizes the importance of emotions in states of mind, but his analysis and where it is placed, you could make an argument. I mean, I'm not an expert in this, but these are just some questions I have. You could make the argument that he's talking about emotions in two very different ways. And secondly, is it emotions specifically when we talk about financial speculation? Is it emotions as such, or are these emotions and heightened expectations a rational response to uncertainty? In the presence of uncertainty, is this how you act? So where does emotions proper come in this? I mean, in the example of the beauty contest, for example, to go by what you think the herd will do is a rational response to uncertainty. So how do we think of emotions in that way? The second thing, and I think this is important in any, I mean, I'll take just like 2 minutes. This is an important thing to do. And I think that any book, any work that engages with this, because you have written there Russell's quote that, Russell said that the Keynes and the apostles talk as if life is a succession of agreeable moments. And there's a quote says that, of course, they don't talk like this. But now the problem is that this is exactly what is picked up by the right, like Neil Ferguson. And they have this horrible, let's put it out there, homophobic view of Keynes, that his notion of in the long run, we're all dead, comes from this homosexual idea because they don't want children. And his only defense was not that it was homophobic, but that Lydia Lokova had miscarriages. I mean, that's an absurd defense of a homophobic view. But I think that needs to be engaged. Is Russell saying the same thing? Are the Keynesians, I mean, Keynes, we know, counters it. That's not what he's saying. But that I think needs to be engaged with, not to give the danger that we are falling back into the same trap.
The conservative question,
Yeah. So I think that needs to be looked at. And my last point of view is just a very brief thing that I think the notion of abundance in Keynes's thought is very interesting to counter it to the neoclassical idea of scarcity. So if not specifically sexuality, what I was interested in, what I get from this is that the notion of abundance is very interesting because that helps you counter scarcity. The notion of art is very interesting because that counters the Marxist view on labor as a source of meaning, whereas Keynes takes beauty as a source of meaning, right? I mean, and it's also Marx finds meaning in human labor. Keynes's idea of the good life is when nobody has to work because they can like appreciate art. Of course, Marx also said everyone will have time to do some work, read some Goethe, etc. So it's not like Marx is anti-art, but he has a different view of meaning. And I think that's a very nice way to posit Keynes again. I mean, we have enough of work on the economics of Keynes as opposed to neoclassicals and Marxists. But this is a nice view of how Keynes's idea of what is a good life then separates him from the neoclassicals and the Marxists. If the good life is about abundance and art and appreciating beauty, that's very different from scarcity. And that's very different from labor as a source of meaning for human life. And I think that would be then to, if not to trace exactly how it comes into economics, I think we shouldn't focus so much on causal links as economists want to do. But I think that would be a lovely framing. And you've brought this out. It's there. It's something that's, that's really striking me that this is a lovely way to look at it. But I think that would be a great way to structure a paper and then bring him out as being very distinct in a more philosophical way than from the neoclassicals and the Marxists. So I'll stop there. And, Ruchira, if you would like to respond to this, we could have about 5 minutes of this, and then we could go to questions. Again, those who have any questions, you can drop it in the box. Thanks.
All right, so responding, thanks, Rahul. Those were really good comments. I think I'm going to do a rewrite at some point. I've been thinking of doing a redraft Mostly because the draft as I've currently sent it is also stuck on a particular time period. It looks at 1901 to 1915, after which the sex diaries end. That could be out of respect to the people who were in there, but and also Keynes himself became a much more popular intellectual, so I think it became necessary for him to discontinue those diaries. That is a major issue. I'm researching the polyamory question quite assiduously now. First, I started reading The Ethical Slut, which is considered the polyamorous Bible by Donny Eastman and Janet Hardy. And they are, looking at sexuality from the BDSM lens. And I mean, there I'm looking for these economic ideas, as to jealousy, the idea of scarcity, how to overcome that idea of scarcity. I believe that Keynes did that in his life when he was particularly dealing with Strachey and issues with Duncan Grant. Now, of course, you're absolutely right about the idea of higher sodomy. It was said in jest, but the apostles were very serious about it. So much so that Strachey would insist on it, that it was for them a major organizing principle. And the apostles grow up, like they don't grow up and all start leading heteronormative lives. Rather, they settle down essentially. Duncan Grant marries Vanessa Bell. But despite them settling down, what happens is they continue to live, they continue to influence one another and help one another out. And essentially, they live like one big family. So much so that when Keynes passes away, he actually leaves a portion of, he leaves an income for Duncan Grant with Lydia, etc., etc. The conservative argument, I think you're absolutely correct. One needs to avoid, falling into that conservative trap, especially when we bring about issues of sexuality. Usually, the conservatives are the first ones to jump on it to say, yes, yes, look, Keynes did not have children. He was not bothered about the long run. Actually, Keynes really wanted to have children. He had a joke about how he is Baron Keynes and therefore Barren Keynes. It's so good that you're laughing at this. My students don't laugh at this. They think it is absolutely ridiculous. But that was, like all these little jests and these little jokes are actually very important to how the apostles and the Bloomsburys organize themselves. And their role as they're a unit. They're like the household in your conservative economy. They help each other, they invest each other's savings. Keynes actually managed Leonard Woolf's estate, and another of his friends, I think Bunny Garnett and so on. They look for places where they can position each other and save each other from going to war. So it's like it's what in sexuality studies they call the polycule. So they are like a polycule in that sense, and they continue to be like that. And they all raise children like that. So it's not just that Keynes didn't have children, but he had Vanessa Bell's child, who they all looked after. So it's a slightly different setup, as to like slightly unorthodox system as to how they look about it. That being said, conservative comments on Keynes are many. One was his role as a eugenicist. He was actually vice president of the British Eugenics Society. And, I think feminism itself has had a very complicated relationship with eugenics, going back to Margaret Sanger and Planned Parenthood, where the right to abortion came as, basically weeding out the so-called less desirable elements of society. So feminism also has, not particularly idealistic remnants. Okay, so I am still on time. Are there any questions from the audience?
Yeah, if you have any questions, please do drop it in. Yeah, I mean, thanks for the response, Ruchira. I mean, I also found it quite ridiculous that one line of thought would be that he is homosexual, therefore he won't have children, for a man who wrote a wonderful essay called Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. So I mean, it's a ridiculous way to argue back, but it's also a clear mischaracterization of Keynesian thought. Yeah, we have one question, I think. Are you able to see it, Ruchira?
Q&A, yes. Yeah, there it is. Do you have it?
So let me just read it out. I have a question. This is from Haromas. I have a question about polyamory and reciprocity. Is the fact that Keynes kept his sex diary not only related to his own thinking about the reciprocity aspect of states of mind and not so much the emotional part? No, that's interesting. It's an interesting question. Thinking about reciprocity forced him to think hard about expectations. And didn't Keynes transpose his hard thinking about expectations to other domains? That's a very interesting question.
A very interesting question. I have not thought about reciprocity. Whereas, you know, reciprocity is a very important aspect of polycules and polyamorous relationships. In fact, that is the polyamorous ethic, that you know, there is an equivalence of gestures, and also you know, without that certain feeling of ownership, where they commit to also more broader open circuits as opposed to the heteronormative family. Um, was he thinking so much about reciprocity rather than the emotional part? Oh, I suppose he was. And, you know, Keynes does not answer the question of the ABC love example. He leaves it as a rhetorical question. Um, he later brings it up again in, I think, theories of probability, where he talks about how the unity of x and y is not function of x plus function of y, but function of x plus y, because x and y tend to affect one another. So yeah, I do think, I mean, I'm not entirely sure how to bring reciprocity into it, but it is a very important aspect of polyamorous relationships, and therefore he would have to actually think about you know, expectations of one another.
Yeah, we have another question from Sharmin. In the context of emotion and care in economics, did this group say anything about rationality or individualism in economics?
Oh, yes, that's a very important question. Actually, my other work is on care. So that's also why I got interested in this topic. Um, and, you know, I came across, I think there was one framing which I really appreciated. You know, when we think about care, we also think about it from a very naive lens that, you know, it is about meeting material needs, taking care of one another, and economics is all about care. That's how I used to think, and I still think that way in part. But then I went to the Care Hub conference in Oxford this time, and they were talking about this really, they were talking about deter care as care, or also about monitoring. So, like mothers monitoring their children. In China, in fact, they usually stick nanny cams in every room, and they monitor what their children are up to. And there's a lot of new research on, you know, also talking to children and asking them how they feel about being monitored. But is this monitoring labor also a kind of care labor? And I started to think then about care, like, is care necessarily you know, fuzzy, you know, good feeling kind of thing? And then you know, then I came up across this paper which talked about care as a thick concept as opposed to a thin concept. So we have to get out of like good or bad. And you find that also in my early beliefs, where Keynes talks about, you know, how uh, you know, the Bloomsburys and the apostles are thinking about caring for each other. And he says that, you know, sometimes when we think about the economy, should we think about it as good state of being or bad state of being? Like when we are thinking about the good, or G. Moore's idea of the good or the good life, is it good or bad? Or do we need to think about it more as, you know, other kinds of adjectives like fun or not fun, fun or not, or pleasing, aesthetically pleasing or not? So he also brings in these ideas of thick and thin concepts as opposed to good or bad. And rationalism is hanging like, you know, how does he think about rationality? Certainly not in the neoclassical framework where you have necessarily this probability distribution of risks which you can always evaluate. Rather, for Keynes, uncertainty rather than rationality is fundamental. That is a fundamental state of being to which human beings are responding. And how do they respond? In the beauty contest example, they say it is by, you know, trying to do what they think the herd will do. But I think there's more to it. I'm actually going to reread chapter 12 again before I do a rewrite of this paper.
I think we have time for one more question, and this will be the last question. This is by Moksh, who says they're interested in understanding how the concept of self-care time is factored into economic models, particularly in the context of gender. I think this will be our last question. So Ruchira, I'm very sorry, but I'd have to rush you on this answer. If you could just provide a
Okay,
quick
I'll
answer.
provide this one very quickly. That's my other paper. No, but I don't know. I don't think Keynes has much to say on self-care. But self-care in economic models, I'm writing a paper right now with Kavita Rajeshwari, where we merge, where we basically try to understand how paid and unpaid care work affects self-care.
All right. Thank you so much, Ruchira, and thanks for everyone who asked these questions. These were lovely questions and really heightened the discussion. I'd like to pass on the session now back to Shaman and Iman Mitra. And yeah, looking forward to continuing this discussion. Thank you, Ruchira, so much, and thank you, Rishi, as well. See you. Bye.
Yes. Hi, everyone, and thanks, Ruchira, for that wonderful presentation, and Rahul for your discussion points as well. So now I'd like to move on to Iman's presentation. So just briefly to introduce Iman. So Iman Mitra teaches modern Indian history at the Department of History and Archaeology at Shiv Nadar University. His research interests include the history of the economic discipline, economic history, and political economy of South Asia, state and non-state networks of dissemination and economic knowledge, especially in colonial and post-colonial contexts. His latest publications include The Island of the Day After, Digital Epidemiology, Artificial Intelligence, and Biopolitics of Future, which is in Subhash Ranjan Chakrabarti and others edited volume, The Long 2020. And he has another chapter titled Marx Theory of Rent, a speculative reading, which is in Achin Chakrabarti et al. Edited book Capital. So these are his recent publications, but in fact, the one which Iman has not listed in his bio, and which I found very interesting, was his article some years ago on the vernacularization of political economy in 19th century Bengal, where he's talking about Bengali texts on political economy, which was a very interesting article that I have also used and referred to extensively. So anyway, with that intro, I would like to pass on the stage to Iman, who is going to now present his very interesting paper. Yeah, Iman, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Shaman. That was a very generous addition to the official introduction. So I sent you the long paper, but obviously we don't have time to discuss all of that. So I'll read out just a section, the first section from the paper. But I think from the reading itself, it should be clear the argument which I'm trying to make. So I have written this paper as part of a project on the history of the Hindu College of Calcutta, which was established in 1817 and was later renamed as the Presidency College in 1855. The paper focuses on the history of instruction in political economy at the college over a span of 6 decades, although in this presentation I'll only talk about a period of roughly 15 years, from 1840 to 1855. I argue that throughout the course of the 19th century, there had been doubts and conflicting opinions about the need for instruction in political economy. One may be tempted to compare this situation with how the discipline was received in Victorian Britain, which would perhaps make it a part of a global narrative of dissemination of economic knowledge. As enticing that may be, it also runs the risk of devaluing the element of colonial difference. In fact, as quite a few studies show, there was a similar sense of uncertainty around the proper way of teaching political economy back in the metropole. For example, I'm quoting from one of these studies. The study of political economy in British universities around the middle of the century, 19th century that is, was not well developed, but no one seriously disputed the need to include some political economy in the curriculum in one form or another, unquote. Does that mean that the colonial case was simply one of derivative anxiety? We shall get a sense now that the matter was far from being simple, although it will be mature to argue there was an absolutely new approach to the discipline being formed due to the specific conditions in the colony. The problem does not necessarily lie with the fact that there could be a shared despondence among the colonial administrators and their metropolitan masters when it came to the policy regarding teaching of the subject. What is problematic is the assumption that the career of the discipline in the colony followed the same footprints of linear progression from Adam Smith to J. Mill to the Marginal Revolution, whereby the establishment of the so-called scientificity of the discipline and its acceptance as a prestigious university subject coincided after much tribulation at the turn of the 20th century. What we shall see in the following narrative is that such easy associations are not always tenable. The coincidence of scientificity and academic prestige does not exercise the subterranean doubts and anxieties, at least in the colony. In the rest of the presentation, I shall try to show how an instruction in political economy could not be imagined outside a network of disciplines whose didactic strengths and limitations were sometimes complemented and sometimes supplemented by a specific imagination of political economy that brought various strands together in order to attend to these concerns. So a narrative starts in 1840. In October of the same year, the General Committee of Public Instruction wrote a response to the Governor General Auckland's Minute on Education. In the response, the committee asked for the provision of, quote, the services of a lecturer on the principles of jurisprudence and political economy, unquote, at the Hindu College. The decision to introduce a course on law and political economy had some thinking behind it. As we know, the principal debate in the early days was focused on the correct orientation of public instruction caught between the opposing views of the Orientalists and the Anglicists on the preferred medium of instruction. Bentinck's Minute in 1835 and Auckland's subsequent Minute in 1839 strengthened the Anglicist position. But at the depth of the debate lay a more serious contention between universal knowledge and local experience. Political economy as a discipline played a pivotal role in this debate despite the tentativeness with which it was welcomed by the educationists and officials of the East India Company. Many thought, including James Mill, that the principles of the knowledge of political economy would not be sufficient to manage the peculiar nature of the unspeakably important, most peculiar and difficult duties, this is actually from Mill, in the colony. There were, of course, dissenting voices which insisted on the training in political economy for the very fact of its liberal universalism finding a place even in the colony. The combination of law and political economy, on the other hand, presented a unique opportunity to bring forth both the perspectives together. In the General Report on Public Instruction in the Bengal Presidency for the year 1840-43, Charles Hay Cameron, British jurist and the then President of the Council, added a minute on the importance of instruction in jurisprudence for both the Indian students and the British civilians training at the College of Fort William. Cameron argued that a professor of law in India should focus on jurisprudence while talking about both the general principles of positive law and the particular forms they might therein assume. He also cautioned the prospective professor against discussing laws which did not strictly pertain to the domain of jurisprudence. He further added, and it's from the minute, I will illustrate what I mean by an example. One important portion of the laws of a country is the laws of the customs. But if our lecturer were to undertake to show how far the customs laws of India aim at objects consistent with utility and how far they attain those objects, he would have to draw his principles not from law or jurisprudence, but from political economy, unquote. By combining a training in political economy with law, the Council, therefore, was trying to extend the domain of the field of study, whereby it would be possible to explore the utilitarian aspects of customary laws as well. What Cameron seemed to propose was a distinction between two different types of universalism. universalism of positive law and that of utilitarian political economy. These two types of universalism were supposed to complement each other. Although one may cite the examples of instruction in political economy separately from law in Indian institutions, including the Hindu College, to argue that the universalism of political economy was independent of that of law, but not the other way around, at least for Cameron. In any case, the identification of the supplementary power of political economy to address the domain of customs was a curious point of departure in the early discussions on Western education in India. Even 30 years later, the strength of the argument did not wane. While talking about the impact of English education in 1872, Arthur Howell, the Undersecretary of the Home Department, Government of India, wrote, quote, "You cannot teach the European system of geography, astronomy, or medicine without exploring the Hindu system. You cannot teach political economy or social science without coming into collision with the theory and practice of caste," unquote. On the other hand, Henry Maine was famously opposed to the idea of applying the analytical conceptions of law and political economy to understanding and governing primitive or ancient societies. His words, of course, primitive and ancient societies, of which India was the prime example, unquote. In 1853, Cameron published an address to the British Parliament on the duties of Great Britain to India, with special reference to the education of the native population. An energetic Benthamite of his time, Cameron was particularly fond of the discipline of political economy, as evinced in his earlier statement. Replete with numerous quotations from the Greek and Roman philosophers, and of course Becker's Minute on Education, the address talked about the history and impact of Western education in great detail. According to Cameron, a new plan of the scholarships in the Indian institutions was devised by Edward Ryan, who became the second president of the General Committee for Public Instruction after Macaulay in 1838, with active support from Governor General Auckland. The plan required systematic organization of very strict examinations in all the subjects taught at the colleges, through which a standard of education could be estimated. This is a marked shift from the earlier system, where the scholarships did not follow any specific rule based on merit or status. The different branches of study mentioned in a scheme published by the committee were revised in 1846, when Cameron was the president of the Council of Education, and included literature, mental and moral philosophy, history, mathematics, natural philosophy, logic and grammar, vernaculars, and of course political economy. The scheme also mentioned the texts which were to be followed for each subject. For the first class, more advanced level, the text for political economy was Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations with John McCulloch's notes, and for the second class, the recommended author was Wayland. Francis Wayland's The Elements of Political Economy was mentioned in other documents as well, which leads to some confusion as to the level at which the text was studied. The report of the Council for the period 45-46 mentioned it as the preferred text for the second class in the college department, as described by Cameron. However, the report for 49-50 assigned a text to the students appearing for the junior scholarship from the school department. So it was being followed both in the college level and also at the school level. It seems that in the subsequent years, the scheme of study was revised again and the recommended text changed. The choice of Wayland's text was also significant. The book was the collection of his lectures delivered to the senior class in Brown University, where he was the president and professor of moral philosophy. He was drawn to the study of political economy for two reasons. First, the facts of political economy could be, in his own language, brought into natural and methodological arrangement, unquote. But the existing works on the subject did not prove, again, from him, serviceable either to the general student or to the practical merchant, unquote. Wayland wanted to fill this lacuna by writing a book in which the principles would be laid in the simplest of languages with suitable illustrations from everyday life. Secondly, he found the principles of political economy, quote, so closely analogous to those of moral philosophy, unquote, the discipline in which he specialized. Even though he claimed in the preface that he would try to keep the two disciplines from intermixing, sometimes they did seem to complement each other, starting from the introduction, where he argued that a human's labor gave them the right to exclusive possession of the value that they created. This was surely a very different articulation of the theory of value from Smith's, or for that matter, Ricardo's. Like Ricardo, Wayland also offered an intrinsic theory of value, but unlike the former, he did not put emphasis on the relative quantity of labor required to produce the value in a commodity. He stated, quote, "The particular quality in any substance which renders it capable of gratifying human desire is called its value," unquote. This remarkable definition followed from his own interpretation of the nature of the discipline. For him, political economy was concerned with those laws which govern the relationship between the individual or social human beings and their objects of desire. As mentioned earlier, Wayland's decision to keep moral philosophy and political economy apart did not always work. His notions of value were influenced by his discussion of the relationship between justice and property in his textbook on moral philosophy, which he published in 1835. There, talking about the modes in which the right of property may be acquired, he commented, "Whatever value I have created by my own labor or by the innocent use of the other means of happiness which God has given me is mine," unquote. The choice of Wayland's text for both the senior and junior scholarships indicated interest in a combined training in political economy and moral philosophy, which was further endorsed in the report of the Council for the year 1849-50, where 60 marks were allotted for mental and moral philosophy and political economy together in the senior scholarship examination. It seems that the separation between the two streams was not practiced till the middle of the century, which is not surprising given the fact that even Adam Smith was accused by his contemporaries for converting the chair of moral philosophy into a professorship of trade and finance. Besides Smith's Wealth of Nations and Wayland's Elements, another text which was mentioned in Cameron's address deserves our attention. From the scheme of study, Cameron wrote, "It was our custom to select every year the subjects of the scholarship examination for the ensuing year and to publish them for the guidance of the professors and students," unquote. This means that the examinations in different years had different syllabi and different reference books as well. Cameron gave two examples of these different lists of subjects for 2 consecutive years, 1851 and 1852. In 1851, the list of subjects for the first class did not mention political economy, but in the following year, the list included the subject with Jones on rent as the reference. Richard Jones, the professor of political economy at the King's College London and Malthus's successor at the college at Haileybury, published his magnum opus, an essay on the distribution of wealth and on the sources of taxation, in 1831. From the list, it is apparent that the council wanted its students to focus on probably the most notable aspect of the book, its insistence on placing rent at the center of the economic discourse. In a long preface elucidating the history of the discipline, Jones told his readers that his intention of starting the book with an analysis of rent came from the fact, quote, "that the greater part of the nations of the earth are still in that state which is properly called agriculture, that is, in which the bulk of their population depends wholly on agriculture for subsistence, and because in this state of society, the relations between the proprietors of the soil and its occupiers determine the details of the conditions of the majority of the people and the spirit and forms of their political institutions," unquote. In many ways, the choice of Jones's text was a remarkable decision on part of the council. Jones's critique of the deductive theory of differential rent, pioneered by Ricardo and Malthus and endorsed by James Mill, in favor of a more inductive theory based on the actual systems of ground rent in different parts of the world, made him somewhat of an esoteric figure in the history of the economic discipline. By choosing his theory of rent as an introduction to the discipline, the council might have initiated a long debate in the history of instruction of economics in the colony, how to familiarize the students with the abstract principles of the discipline with references to more concrete examples from their surroundings. Now, compared with Wealth of Nations, the choice of the other two texts seem less obvious at first glance. But if we take into account the facts that Jones was already appointed to the chair of political economy and history at the college at Haileybury, and Wayland's Elements was the most popular textbook on political economy in America, it makes sense to include them in the syllabus as two influential texts of the day, although with lots of difference between them in terms of methodology as well as content. Wayland's moral philosophy and political economy bore marks of his evangelical Protestant perspective and provided critical responses to utilitarian and liberal religious views of William Paley, whose Principles of Moral and Political Philosophy was a popular textbook in American colleges. Wayland offered an interpretation of political economy that matched his evangelical moral philosophy. We already know that Horace William Clift's Elements of Political Economy was already the textbook of political economy in schools in the Allahabad division. Now, Clift also made his evangelical position pretty clear when he argued, quote, there is scarcely a doctrine of political economy which is not a sharp weapon wherewith to strike Hinduism and in the eye of reason to overthrow it, unquote. A detailed study of the influence of evangelicalism on the shaping of political economic thought globally and in India is beyond the scope of this presentation, but clearly there existed another strand of connection between moral philosophy and political economy in the wake of increasing evangelical activities in India, which the metropolitan history of political economy does not usually acknowledge. From the discussion above, it is evident that the students of the Hindu college in the middle of the 19th century were being exposed to at least three strands of economic thought. One, Smith's political economy within an interpretive framework of McCulloch, who was probably the most influential popularist of the discipline at the time. Wayland's political economy, whose point of departure was evangelical moral philosophy. And three, Jones's inductive political economy that attempted to ground the abstract principles in historically and geographically localized conditions. None of these thoughts was particularly akin to the utilitarian ideas that the colonial administration was still associating itself with. Whether the dissonance between the pedagogical framing and the administrative inclinations was the source of the tentativeness with which the discipline would be treated even in the later decades remains an open question. Meanwhile, the students of the college were faced with questions in the scholarship examinations on the peculiar character of riot rents or the possibility of clash of interests between the landlords and the other classes of the community, clearly derived from Jones's writings. Mahendralal Shom, a student of the Hindu college, in his answer to a question on the riot's interest in improvement of the land under cultivation, wrote in 1851, whilst improvements in the cultivation of the land are daily introduced, the poor riot finds himself becoming more and more wretched every day, and many are compelled to give up the cultivation of their lands. He further added, law might have some bounds, but oppression has none. Unquote. Jones's discussion of riot rent in India mentioned the possibilities of oppression and tyranny, but did not express it in such an evocative language. Clearly, the exposure to various strands of economic thought intermixed with other fields of study like law and moral philosophy was helping these students grasp their immediate reality in ways peculiar to the colonial experience. Due to shortage of time, I shall stop here. So far, I have presented few snippets from the first 15 years of the history of instruction in political economy at the Hindu College. In 1855, the college would be renamed as Presidency College and would go through a series of changes by turning into a public institution from a private college. 2 years later, with the founding of the University of Calcutta, it would become part of a large network of colleges which would follow the same syllabi and protocols of examination. In my paper, I've talked about this moment in great detail. In the paper that I sent, I've talked about this moment in great detail and showed how the pedagogic and institutional networks work together in the rest of the century to posit the discipline in various other disciplinary configurations. A major break came with the inclusion of political economy as a special paper in the study of history at the collegiate level. But we can discuss that during the Q&A. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Iman, for that highly detailed and very rich archival, work that you have presented in the paper. I mean, since I have had a chance to go through this paper, I mean, I can easily testify and say that it is a clear, it's a very good exposition of the historian's craft and shows that extensive, detailed archival look, which always brings out a different kind of a history, as opposed to when we are looking at say a more larger organizational sense. So say like as opposed to looking at the entire university and its records, like in the sense, like say Calcutta University, which was formed then in 1857, if I'm correct, and then which Presidency College came under its supervision. So right. So Iman, I have broadly two major, like, comments slash questions, which you can try to address in some form. And in fact, so what I want to highlight are a couple of points, because some of your points in a sense relate to a bit of what I also look at, some questions. So so I like the way, like in the first in the early part of your paper, you had emphasized upon that point, that contestation in the kind of the relentless discursivity, as you mentioned, in terms of how political economy was being framed in a particular site of Hindu College, then renamed Presidency. This contestation that you mentioned between universal knowledge and local experience. So in the and this is something that is carried on through right up to even the early 20th century, and I think it's something that even troubles economics in India today as well, that especially the kind of textbooks and things like that. So one, of course, I would like to ask you is that towards the end of the 19th century, we come towards when Indian nationalist economic thought is coming to the fore. They're raising the same question, but in a different politically charged manner, where they're speaking about the universalist assumptions which they feel that the educators and administrators seem to be providing, goes against the particular historical nationalist experience. So in a sense, how do they, and I know you're still working upon that progression in a sense. So even if you have something to comment, maybe compare, or is there a particular difference as such as to how it comes up and all. And in that sense, I find it very interesting that you mentioned that Richard Jones is seen as someone whose introduction into the syllabus is seen as a way, in a sense, of grounding political economy, that giving it a more concrete historical basis, in the sense of providing more examples by which students can relate to abstract theory. So that's one part of it. The second major comment that I have, and in one sense, I think someone who is working on a discursive history usually anticipates this kind of question coming in, but I will put it nonetheless. So my qualification being that, of course, I don't believe that an approach focusing on the discursive practices and what we call as a sense of material history and material politics are necessarily opposed approaches. However, for now, I will adopt that sort of binary and kind of and ask you something around that. So, of course, you have focused on this anxiety that you're speaking about of colonial educators as to how to speak about the science of political economy and then later economics to college students in India. And in a sense, this is something again which I look at, but in a sort of different sense. I look at the larger political anxiety of especially the British educational service, in the sense of where they felt that providing this kind of like teaching political economy in an unfettered manner without, a rational kind of basis in it and all, leads to the fomentation of political discontent, because of the kind of liberal nature of the discipline as it was being taught. So in that sense, what I'm trying to get at with this point and ask you to perhaps elaborate is, how do you see some of the material politics playing out side by side with the discussion that you have elaborated upon so well in your paper? And I mean, maybe with that, like, for example, what was happening in the sense of when the university was being formed? What were the compulsions perhaps behind that? And and what I'm interested to know is what were the maybe the extraneous factors that were perhaps leading to this discussion on, say, to kind of foster both, to bring in local experience into, say, maybe what is otherwise considered to be universalist knowledge or something like that. So perhaps if you could just comment on some of these, and also, yes, and then we will and hope to get some questions from the audience as well.
Thank you, Sharvil. First of all, both the questions are very important, and I would try to address both of them, but I guess not very adequately. Two reasons, because this is just one half of the project that I'm doing, because the second half, of course, will be in the 20th century, where I'll talk about the history of instruction in political economy in the 20th century at Presidency College up to, let's say, 1960s, because that's the 1961 or 62 is the year when political economy or economics would have, for the first time, its independence existence. Because till 1961, it would still be associated with the Department of Political Philosophy. So 61 is the year when political philosophy becomes political science, and economics gains finally its autonomy from all the other disciplinary formations. So my basic idea is to talk about a period where economics or political economy is being taught in relation to other disciplines, and how the histories of these disciplines are becoming important to understand what is being taught as political economy, what is the system of economic thought that was emerging at the time, and how that system is part of what I'm calling this relentless discursivity. But that doesn't mean, of course, that I would be not talking about the material and institutional practices, because that's something which becomes very important. And that is why I put so much importance in the later part of the paper on the institution of Calcutta University and certain compulsions that it brings into the equation, and the way the Calcutta University standardization of syllabus and all of that becomes a very important question. And also movement. So Hindu College from 1817 to 1855 was a private institution. It's a private college. It's like a private university that we have now. It was being funded by individual donors. In 1855, it was acquired by the government. So it becomes a public institution. So then 1857, it was brought under the edifice of the Calcutta University. So all these decisions, all these policy decisions also played very important roles in the reconfiguration of the discipline itself in the colony. This is something that some kind of the longer argument, or rather a broader argument, which I'm trying to make. Now, specifically about the nationalist thought, I am going to talk about it, of course, much more in the second part of the project in the 20th century. But right now, what I'm trying to do, and you are very familiar with this, because now there is a template of talking about history of political economy in India, only following rather sort of in a retrospective manner from going back to Ranade and Kale and all of that. And that's a great template, to be honest. By the same time, when I started working on 19th century, I discovered in my previous work as well, and here, the esotericness, what we consider esoteric, but it may not be esoteric for the 19th century people, of course, or rather, I mean, in today's terms, heterodoxy of the practices, of the discipline, of the syllabus, and its conversations with other disciplines, that kind of becomes a secondary issue when we do history of economic thought in India. Because either you have this whole template of, again, coming from Stokes and others, Amdi Rajan, the utilitarian premise of Indian policy making, which governs the history of political economic thought. And then on the other hand, you have this other insistence on the Friedrich List and then Ranade and that kind of a trajectory. Now, I'm not saying that didn't happen. Of course, these two elements were very strongly there. But at the same time, there were other elements which were very influential at the time. And that created the heterodoxical practice of instruction in political economy. My point is that actually, if one wants to do a history of economic thought in India, it's not sufficient to focus on only the writings of Indian economic thinkers, but also to focus on what is being taught at the college and university level, and also at the school level. with the economic, I mean, there isn't any history of economic pedagogy, to be honest, in India so far. So this is where I'm coming from. So I think I would like to connect with that history of Indian economic thought, the nationalist Indian economic thought, from that perspective only, that how much of that is entering the discussions, the classroom discussions. And the kind of materials I have seen already, there is actually a lot of scope to talk about. But again, with the insistence that those conversations are not happening by imagining political economy or economics as an autonomous field of study. Like, again, from throughout the second half of the 19th century, political economy was a special paper in history. It's an honors paper in the history course. And then from 99 to 1961, it is being taught with political philosophy. And in political philosophy, people are getting trained in various kinds of rights. Have been Rousseau and Locke feature in that syllabus. So what kind of amalgamation is coming out of that is something I'm going to ask in the second half. The other question about the politics, I think I've already responded to that question in the first one as well, because the external factors are important and they are there. But what I'm trying to imagine is how these external factors are somehow being internalized in this kind of paradigmatic configuration called political economy. So political economy is much more than political economy in the late 19th, early 20th century, even in the early 20th centuries, even after the inclusion of Marshall and Pigou in the syllabi.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. In fact, in fact, with your response has been very really clarified matters to a great extent. And in fact, it's very interesting, this thing you mentioned about the autonomy of the disciplines. It's actually at least in the Indian universities and all, it's much more mid 20th century phenomena, at least at the departmental level. And it's interesting to see how different regions and universities have adopted different kind of disciplinary, it's like these twin disciplines with political economy. In the case of Calcutta, it was always with political philosophy. So in 1908, 1909, the first department being at Calcutta being of political economy and political philosophy. In the case of Bombay University, it became economics and sociology. So it's fascinating to see, also depending on who were the professors and their own interests and inclinations. So yeah, maybe we can comment on that since we do have about 10 more minutes. So I'll read out the question that has been put forward by Haromas, and it's actually a very interesting question. He asks that it is very interesting to hear that Richard Jones was taught at Hindu College. Jones and William Whewell were strongly anti-Ricardians and strongly anti-utilitarian. Their criticism was also motivated to emphasize harmony of landed and other interests in society, in contrast with Ricardo. My question is, how utilitarian was the colonial administration and was one of the reasons for Jones's text to stress the harmony of interests between the colonized and the colonizers? So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very important question. Actually, this impression that we have that English administration or British administration in India was absolutely utilitarian, it comes from basically Eric Stokes's fantastic, brilliant study, English Utilitarians in India. And later on, people have worked on that, and mostly so what happened since Eric Stokes is that people were trying to find utilitarianism in everything. And it's true that many of the administrators were strong believers in utilitarianism. That does not necessarily mean that every policy was actually being governed by some utilitarian principle or the other. Especially after the 1850s, after the mutiny, when the power shifted from the company to the crown, the government took very clear stance that the utilitarian principle of intervention by law would not be used anymore to talk about, let's say, situations of social reform. So from 1857 onwards, we rarely see any mention of any utilitarian doctrine in the context of social reforms. So in the age of consent debate, for example, nobody was talking about the utilitarian urge to change the law or anything like it happened in case of sati or in case of widow remarriage. So this whole idea that utilitarianism played a very important role is true actually for the period that Stokes is talking about, till 1840s. Since 1840s, that was not the case. On the other hand, we often tend to forget that Richard Jones might be an esoteric figure within the metropolitan history of political economy. But for the colony, he is already an influential person because he is the principal and the chair of political economy at the College at Haileybury. So all the English officials who are coming to India from 1830s onwards are actually being trained by Jones and not Malthus. So this is an important point to remember, and this actually is a point which has been extensively covered by Upal Chakraborty in his book, which got published in the last 2 years. I think it's called Reassembling the Local, where he is talking about Richard Jones's influence on the agrarian policy making in British India, even in the early 19th century. So by focusing only on Ricardo, or by focusing only on the influence of the English British Romantics on the administrators, or the other kinds of influence in the 18th century on Philip Francis and all, but that is one side of the story. But in the 19th century, there are so many other strands, also because we usually look at that history from a very standardized perspective about political economy or economics in the 20th century. Even, and just to add to what you were saying, Sherman, even in England, in Cambridge University, economics was not being taught as a separate discipline even in the 60s. So it was not a global practice. There are very few colleges, and in fact, in those colleges or universities, economics was being taught as a separate subject only because they couldn't find any other professors teaching any other discipline. The standard idea was that economics was not a proper science which can be taught in isolation. Only from the 1960s onwards, we see that all the universities are following suit to have an independent or autonomous economics department. The story wasn't like that before the 1960s in most of the places in the world.
Yes, definitely this thing about the autonomy of the department is such. Though since it's interesting you mentioned the example of Cambridge University, because in the sense the way I see it is that the economics tripos that was formed in 1903 and kind of by headed by Alfred Marshall is kind of I see it as kind of like a precursor, again, not to again suggest a complete imposition and linearity of history to say okay from Britain to India. But isn't that because he shifts from first a moral science tripos towards establishing an economics tripos in Cambridge. So in that sense, but of course, yes, what we know of, and which is like you also quote Keith Stribe and Alon Caddish's text in your paper and all. It is all even there they're suggesting that of course through the 19th century, even in Britain and as in India, in fact, most of the discourse around political economy is happening more so in the public sphere. And of course, in the case of India, what you're saying is that the contested aspect of political economy, say for example, that all that which is being discussed by the likes of Nauroji and all, and those debates that are going on are not permeating the university as such. Of course, even I would have to look more at the state of teaching, say in British universities at the time, to see whether there is a coherence between the public level discourse and what is happening within the university in the limited sense to which political economy is taught. But what I also find significant is that since you mentioned Malthus and then Richard Jones as well, and with Malthus being the first professor of political economy, as I mean, that was the first chair of political economy to be established in Britain, and it was to train the civil services, administrators in India. So in that sense, political economy is seen, I mean, it's also seen as an important discipline of governance. to have knowledge of that. And in fact, what you are also suggesting somewhat in your paper and presentation is this very interesting kind of, how to call it, this kind of circulation, as if we use the terminology of the circulation of knowledge that actually happens. And in terms of the development of the 19th, especially of the disciplines in the 19th century, the kind of constant interaction between the colony and the metropole in that sense. So I think that is also something that comes out very interestingly in your paper, and which would be interesting to hear about. I mean, we have about 3 minutes or so, so you can also give some other last remarks, and before we kind of bring an end to the session.
So, I mean, what I basically want to say is this. First of all, political economy, I mean, if one wants to do a history of economic thought in India, one also needs to look at other sides than just the texts that are being written by the economic thinkers. To one very important side, of course, is the pedagogical institutions where economics or political economy is being taught. Now, I don't want to emphasize too much on the connection between what was happening in England and what was happening in India, because that kind of runs the risk, as I said, of saying that, we are following the footsteps of what was happening. That was not necessarily the case. The way political economy was being treated in England, as they say, as part of a public discourse, and actually McCulloch obviously plays a very important role in that. This was not part of a public discourse in that sense in India. It was coming through, in a sense, this administrative training which was happening at Haileybury. Now, again, lots of people focus on what was happening in Haileybury, how Malthus and Jones's ideas are different. So what was happening? When these officials are coming, and that tension always remains, that when they come here and they discover that actually the abstract, so-called abstract principles of the discipline may not be that much applicable in the Indian context, then the kind of anxieties that they have would sometimes get reflected in these policy decisions, these education policy decisions. But that again does not necessarily mean that there is some kind of a derivative sort of relationship that existed between the metropole and the colony. So the second point is that the careers of the discipline are very different in metropole and the colony. So, and importance of certain elements, like in for example, in Britain, nobody would talk about rent, let's say at the end of the 19th century, because rent has lost its prestige as a conceptual category around which you can still organize the discipline. On the other hand, the first thesis and the first book by an Indian on economic theory is written by this guy called Ganeshwar Ghosh, and it was on the Ricardian theory of rent. More interestingly, this person was an English major student. He did his BA and MA in English and then did a PhD at Calcutta University, first economics PhD student at Calcutta University and probably in the country. And that he chose to work on David Ricardo. So where is that coming from? That's also something that's, I think it's an important question to ask. So there was a point when somebody who could do their major courses in English and could still pursue a PhD in economics. Of course, mathematization, etc. We know the answers, some of the answers, but they are not all the answers.
Yeah, so thanks, Simon. In fact, these are you brought up some very important points. I think that we need to build into the history of political economy. I mean, especially in India, and as you're also saying, to situate it within the larger global intellectual history and global disciplinary history. I think it's a very useful kind of intervention that a lot of historians of economic thought would really benefit from, and we hope to have more interactions along these lines. So anyway, I'd like to call an end to the morning session now. And thank you very much to all our presenters today. I think we've had some very enriching discussions as well. Before we break for lunch, I just like to tell everyone that tomorrow Ideas is also holding a roundtable discussion on the upcoming Lok Sabha elections. This will be held from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. and there are two panels which are being organized, which are very interesting. We will also maybe post the link to that roundtable discussion in the chat box, so you are free to go through that and register for it as well. So right, and with that, I'll call an end to the session. Thank you to all the participants and audience as well for attending here. So we will resume with our second panel on Indian economic thought, and this will start sharp at 1:30 p.m. Okay, so yes, we hope to see you all again then soon, right? Thank you.